Welcome to the Data Strategy Show. My name's Samir Sharma and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. My guest today is the brilliant and inspiring Peter Aiken, who I regard as the godfather of data strategy. Peter is an acknowledged data management authority, an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, and is now back in the saddle as president of Dharma International, a 30-year ongoing love affair. He's also the Associate Director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. For more than 35 years, Peter has learned from working with hundreds of data management practices in 30 countries, including some of the world's most important. Among his 10 books are the first on CDOs, The Case for Data Leadership, the first describing the monetization of data for profit or for good, and the first on modern strategic data thinking. Peter also hosts the longest-running data management webinar series hosted by Dataversity, and from 1999, before Google, before data was big, and before data science, he founded Data Blueprint, a consulting firm that helped more than 150 organizations leverage data for profit, improvement, competitive advantage, and operational efficiencies. His latest venture is Anything Awesome. Enjoy the show, and don't forget to like, share, and comment. Thank you for listening. Peter Aiken, it's an absolute honor to have you on the Data Strategy Show today. I'm so delighted. However, I can't see you, but you've left me with a wonderful image of a slightly beaten down and as we just talked about, sardonic Peter Aiken as Homer Simpson, or maybe the other way around. But thank you so much for being my guest today, and it's an absolute pleasure.
Well, of course, and thank you for inviting me. The Data Strategy podcast is one that is getting some attention out there, and quite frankly, if people are saying anything about data besides data, if people besides data people are saying data strategy, you have succeeded, sir.
Well, thank you very much. That's brilliant coming from you. In terms of data strategy, you are the godfather of data strategy. And believe me, it's of great respect that when I've read your book, and you can see all the markings and everything like that. But data strategy has always been one of the things that I have labored in and worked with a number of organizations. I mean, you've worked across probably every single sector one could imagine, and that career has spanned over 35 years. You've written, 10 books, and the experiences you must have are so rich and unbelievable, I'm sure. And hopefully we'll get to a lot of those today. Data strategy is a bit of maybe it's becoming one of those words that people just say, yes, we have a data strategy. But throughout your career and throughout your experiences, so over the 35 years, how have things changed? Are we still dealing with the same challenges that many organizations had back when you started and throughout your career today? And how prominent has data strategy now become?
So I think it's getting more attention. I don't think we can say it's in the top 10 just yet.
Yeah.
But if we go back, of course, one of the things that we have to do is research and see what has been done. And there was a terrific book on data strategy that was written about 15 years ago by Sid Edelman, Larissa Moss, and it's called Data Strategy. So it's not hard to find. But what they talked about, which I think was correct at the time, they were saying, well, many organizations have multiple styles of databases in them, right? So you may have an Oracle and a Teradata shop. That coexist or something like that. And I know some organizations that have 4 different types. So strategy in those days was about trying to consolidate the data footprint and trying to look, because even then they saw the coming crunch on IT. Everybody has it in their minds in IT that it's going to be faster, better, and cheaper tomorrow. So most CIOs are facing budget decreases instead of budget increases these days, even though they're still delivering excellently in the process. The key for all this, and you know this as well, is that data becomes sort of an afterthought. IT works in a project mental state, and it should. It's the way it works. We've done good things there. We're making good progress. We're increasing our on time and capabilities delivery. But if we try to do data as a project, we get the situation that we have now. And I think nobody is satisfied with the situation now. Right now, there is much more data that can be analyzed. Organizations are storing almost, well, our numbers show that 80% of corporate data is rot. And I don't mean that as a word, it's an acronym. It's data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial.
Right.
Now, if you think about that, now data is starting to get in the way, because now you're trying to say, where is the golden record? What can I update that will correctly get this to work? How can I, these kinds of questions. So it's been very clear over my career that we need data leadership. And I think that's part of the aspect of strategy here that's becoming so helpful. Even in the book, we postulate that maybe the process of becoming a data leader is a two-phase process. The first one is you have to go in and break some things, kind of like a Facebook model, in the sense that there's a lot of ingrained and bad habits that we've had over the years that have to be changed. But also, we need to have somebody that can explain this stuff. And the articulateness, with which you do your podcast interviews and other things, are just one sample of that. If we can't explain this to people outside of our discipline, yes, it feels good to talk to other data people, but we call that preaching to the converted. And so what we've seen is sort of this need for a leadership in data. And of course, the first thing the boss says is, great, I've appointed you a data leader. What are we going to do? And the answer is, well, boss, you are trying to do certain things with the corporation, the organization, whatever it happens to be. And this works well in private sector as well as in public sector. So that's one of the challenges. We talk about mission in the public sector.
Yeah.
But you tell me what we're trying to achieve as an organization. My job is to supply data assets that help us achieve that objective.
Yes.
And that is something that people have been looking for. There's very few CIOs that say, what data do you need to meet the corporate objective? They look instead at uptime and are the contracts being managed well, and is Amazon going to be the end all be all for it that we think it's going to be? Again, just picking on particular pieces.
Sure.
If we don't have somebody focused on the data part of it, then the data part of it will continue to be done as well as it has been done today. And I don't think anybody's looking around their organizations and saying, yep, we manage data extraordinarily well. My knowledge workers don't spend any time looking for it.
Yeah.
We can implement plans and projects and all of these sorts of things very, very easily. No, it's not done well. And so consequently, we need another approach to it.
Sure. And I think that's one of the key things that I've certainly seen. And I think it goes back to what you said about, IT is project based, but data actually is right across the enterprise. It is in every nook and cranny. Everybody's got a bit of data. Someone's using it to make some kind of decision based on what they feel that decision could be, but it's not it's not being charged enough to meet the strategic objectives of this organization. In your book, you talk about the need for pinning the data strategy on business strategy, and that's my strap line in terms of probably taken from all my readings of your books. Just explain that a little bit more for the viewers, and sort of I understand the education piece, and that we have to have the evangelists, but why do we need to pin the data strategy in its bare bones up to the business strategy, and how do we get the CEOs and the C-suite teams to start to consider and embrace that in a way that they can see value? Because I'm not talking about data governance here, where I'm not talking about quality, but I'm talking about pure data strategy. How do you start to have those conversations with them where you say, look, this is how I'm doing from a practical perspective?
It's very interesting. I'm reminded of a story that remember back when we thought server consolidation was going to solve all the world's problems, because we realized the average server was running at about 15%, and smart people could come along and create virtual machines and all the rest of that. And I had an instance that I observed at one of the customers I was working with, where they threw away a machine that hadn't been used in 11 months. And said, well, obviously, if nobody's using it in 11 months, it must be not at all important. Well, it turned out that was the machine that the CFO used to do the book balancing on.
Oh, gosh.
Exactly. You know the rest of that picture.
Oh, my goodness.
What it does, though, is that people, even though we're doing governance, we've been doing governance well for a while now,
Yeah.
The rest of the executive team is not really data literate at this point. And I know that because there's a great joint project between Accenture and Click called the
Yes.
Data Literacy Project.
Yeah.
And their numbers show that 80% of corporate executives would pay out of their own pocket for additional data training, but they do not want to sit around the table and raise their hand when they say, who feels data illiterate, right? So it's a challenging problem. And so we have executives that are not really cognizant of the types of things that we're talking about when they're brought and somebody says, great, and Salesforce says they can solve all of our problems.
Sure.
And don't get me wrong, Salesforce is excellent software. It does a great job. But if you buy Salesforce and put it in and then clean the data after you've put it in Salesforce, everybody's going to say Salesforce isn't working well. Now, Salesforce is working well, but of course, people don't have that level of discernation. So a data strategy for some companies is, oh my goodness, I should do data quality before I implement Salesforce.
Yeah.
And that's not terribly sophisticated, but it happens wrong 9 times out of 10.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, one of the things I'm thinking of is going and selling myself to Salesforce because I could make them much more successful as their product all the way around.
Well, that certainly sounds like a good advantage for you and for them. So, you know, if you were to strip down the essentials, the bare bones of data strategy for the executive team, what would that be?
Well, I actually start off with the definition of strategy. And many people like to look at, you know, fairly dense definition. There's been immense writing on it, but it turns out that if we go back to the Google, statistics that they are so willingly using to provide us, the word strategy did not occur in common vocabulary until about the year 1950.
Yeah.
Prior to that, it was strictly a military concept.
Correct.
And business came along, looked at it and said, oh, it's a good word. We can sell books with it, et cetera, et cetera. And people started talking strategy. And now you have the Michael Porters of the world who, again, have done wonderful work in those areas. But then people say data strategy, right? Well, let's start off with Michael Porter. Michael Porter pretty much proved, I think, to the world that there are only 2 strategic directions. 1, you do better with what you have. 2, you do something different. Yeah. Everything else is a theme and variation on those 2 pieces. And so people say, oh, okay, well, I don't know anything about how to make my data more efficient, but I certainly know what I need to do to be innovative. And so they try to go the innovation route. And again, 9 out of 10 data science projects are failing miserably. There's a terrific book by Amy Webb. I don't know if you've seen it yet, Samir.
No, I haven't.
It's called The Big 9.
Okay.
And she makes a tremendously strong case that if you are not working for one of these 9 companies, your AI is just a play toy.
Right.
Of course, you can figure out which companies these are now. There's 3 of them that are Chinese, and there are 6 of them that are not.
Yeah.
And so getting back to strategy, though, I like to use the military definition of strategy, which is that strategy is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And I illustrate that with 3 very simple strategies that most everybody knows and understands. One of them is Walmart. Even though you're there in London, you certainly know that Walmart's strategy is everyday low price.
Yeah.
And not only do you know it, but every customer knows it, every supplier knows it. They have worked with that cultural aspect of strategy for literally decades, and it works.
And it's a simple thing to remember, which is
it has to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay. You're exactly right, though, because if you take this definition of a pattern in a stream of decisions, that means when you're on the street, you're working at your desk, something happens, you need to know on which side to err.
Correct.
In Walmart, if you err on the side that delivers a better value to the customer, you will never get disciplined at Walmart because that is their strategy. And it's a nice safety net, too. I even knew somebody who had, miscalculated sales for them and reported it publicly, and he wasn't fired because his calculation was based on this strategy, everyday low price. Yeah. So starting off with that, strategy should be simple enough so that everybody in the organization understands the mission. Given that, then, if somebody's doing something with data, and you and I were talking slightly before we started the podcast here, but we both agree that data is increasing at an increasing rate, and our ability to analyze that data is not increasing at that rate. And in fact, our schools are doing a good job of cranking out data scientists, but they need to broaden their focus and get us into some other specialty areas that will help this as well. So the question comes, if you've got a lot of work to do in data and you're doing something in data and it isn't supporting the mission, what are you doing? And
Don't do it. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Why, you know,
and I think the bosses would like to hear that as well. And so, yeah, exactly as you're. Now, there's another part of this though too, which is that organizations say, okay, great. And I literally got off the phone an hour ago talking to a colleague who's in another organization, and they're trying to write a 100-page data strategy.
Oh gosh.
Right. Why do you say that? So I know you have the same reaction that I do, but go ahead.
Why do I say that?
100
pages for a data strategy. It doesn't make sense to me, because you should be able to pick it up and you should be able to understand it within about, maybe 10, 15 pages. Exactly. It should communicate effectively what the business wants to do, and how you're going to get them there. But you don't need to have 100 pages. I mean, I've seen worse than that. That's I've seen 350 pages.
Oh my goodness.
And exactly.
We should just put a book label on it and send it out to Amazon. Right?
I chucked it out of the window. Seriously, I just found it ridiculous. But that was from a very large consultancy. I won't say the name.
But
they
just get paid by the page too, though.
Right? Yeah. It's crazy.
So let's take it another step further. If we're looking specifically for things that will help the organizational strategy, then there have to be some measurables. No CEO worth their salt will say, we're just going to get better next year. That's just not good enough. So they have some specific things that they've done, and it's usually tied to their stock bonuses and their compensation, which is, again, a way of incentivizing high executives. Those numbers should be the ones that you should hit. But as you know from the book too, I also took a slightly different approach, in that I think that the theory of constraints actually describes what we have to do in our data world to make up for the data deficit. Now, again, we've sort of agreed here on this that many organizations aren't in the place they'd like to be with their data, and they'd like to do more. Well, we're getting to just a neutral step, zero, making up for past data deficit, is going to require some work. And basically, you have to look at data delivery in an organization as a system that has some constraints. So the theory of constraints is about looking at those constraints, identifying which are the one or two crucial ones that are hurting you the most, fix them, and then go back and do it again for the next most and the third most. And that is the way that you make things better. Theory of constraints is from Elihu Goldratt, and the book is called The Goal. It's kind of a wonderful little narrative book that describes it. And I'll just tell you a quick story on it, which is that when my wife and I got together about 20 years ago, she is a comptroller and I am obviously a data person. And she made an interesting observation. She said, oh, so you data people haven't actually gotten the concept of a general ledger down yet, right?
Okay.
I thought that was pretty astute, and said, that's the woman I'm going to marry, right? But in addition to that, there's a whole series of things around around finance that we know are bad practices. And the data part of it is something that we've got to get some more maturity around. And we just haven't had a good chance at that yet.
It's interesting that you say that. And we generally at the moment, people are there's a camp on one side which says we've got to treat this thing as an asset. We've got to make sure that we nurture it. We build, products that are going to be aligned to what the business wants to do, or the value piece, and it's going to be something that we can generate for over and over again, and it's never going to go away. But then there's this other side that doesn't really get that, and therefore data doesn't show up on the accounts. It doesn't show up on the P&L. It doesn't show up anywhere. It's not seen as an asset. How do we start to move that? I mean, how do we, and the other thing that I probably don't like about it is when people call it an asset, but then they say, well, it's the new oil. And that just kind of floors it for me, because, oil, is it only has a sort of, finite as a resource in terms of it gets in your car, you use it and then you've got to keep going back and getting more. But it's degradable in that sense. So from one side, how do we get this thing called data to be quite prominent and treat it as an asset? And I think back to Caesar's Casino. I don't know if you know, when they were going, when they were being audited because they were going to go into bankruptcy. I think it was 2014. That the auditors came in and they looked at all the assets because they were going to strip the assets and start to think about where the most valuable pieces were so that they could, leverage that. And they looked at the database. They looked at this unit called the Customer Insights Team, or I can't remember the actual name of them, but about 200 people. But they had every single insight, intelligence, understanding of their customers, and they priced that asset at $1 billion. So, why aren't more people doing that now? Why aren't we actually thinking from that perspective of data is money? And perhaps, that's the only way that people are really going to treat it in a way that is going to be up there with, accounting principles and so on.
So let's go back to the oil metaphor that you described earlier. And I too also like to push back on that one a bit. It's wonderful to think about it something that you can dig through and find good stuff in.
Yeah.
So the mining aspect makes sense on it. But as you pointed out, oil is a production function.
Yeah.
We produce oil. We do not do anything about reusing it. Sometimes when you recycle your lawnmower's oil, that's good, but we're not planning to put it back into production, and we're not going to use it in the next vehicle. There's an entire system that is set up to do this. I like to add just one letter in the front of that. So, Sammy, are you a gardener?
No, my father was, but I'm not a gardener. I don't have I'm, we live in flats in London, so
But some people have them on their windows,
Yes, well, okay, yeah. I mean, no, but I don't have one. So,
and I'm not either. So no, I live in the woods. And
okay, well, you're surrounded by it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you think instead of data as the new soil, then there's two things that come into play there. First of all, everybody who is a gardener knows you don't garden by walking around the yard and flinging seeds in various directions, right?
Of course.
And hoping something good will happen.
Yeah.
Instead, there's a careful preparation. And the second part of it is the time dimension. Nobody plants things on Monday and expects to eat them on Friday, unless you happen to live downwind from Chernobyl.
Right. Exactly. So it's a long game in some.
It's a long game.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the time for measuring improvement should be measured in years. And that's very hard for upper management to digest. Let's do another piece of this though too, which is that let's assume that I make a plan to eliminate that first barrier that I described. Okay. So then I come back and I say, now here's the next thing we're going to focus on. We won that war. We slay that dragon, whatever it is that you want to use, but there's still more to be done. So now your data strategy is now not focusing on the first thing, but it's the second thing. Sure. So one of the things I always advise people to do is to say, let's number your data strategy versions. If you hand somebody something that's called data strategy, and then you do it, and then you hand them another one, they'll say, what was wrong with the one that we had? Whereas if you hand them something that's clearly labeled version 1, when you hand them version 2, it will not be that big of a deal. They'll be like, okay, good. We did the first one. Let's get on with the second one and let's do it. So how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. But I like that because what it actually does is, I always talk about data strategy as an organic kind of approach. And I think that's what you're saying in some respects, but one chunk at a time, take it, get some value, start to measure it, and then, continue. But I don't, I see two sides of the coin. There are some companies that I've seen that have done it okay. And, they've got to a point where they've had some good, good traction in terms of insights, but it's in pockets, it's here and there. So it's not really, going out to the entire business. Or on the other side, I see companies who just say, scrap the, somebody said this to me the other day, which was crazy. No, we don't do data maturity. We don't want to do a data maturity assessment. No value in that. Also, we don't want to do a data strategy. We're just going to go out and we're going to see what our they're part of a group. We're going to see what the group data team did, and we're just going to buy the same tech that they did. And I thought to myself,
yeah,
you're gone. No, I mean, so there's always those camps of tech is going to be the savior, or we'll start a data strategy, but then it gets really difficult, and they think, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do next.
So part of this is understanding that you need to have structural integrity in your initiatives, as well as in your data, as well as in many other things. You mentioned that you're in a flat before. If they had done a bad job on the supporting walls, you'd be worried about when your neighbors started dancing, whether you had to leave the building or not, right? So it's critical to understand, and this is a wonderful set of surveys that I think Tom Davenport has been working on for a while. He asks people, thousands of people, it's good sample size, what are their big problems? And for the last 2 years, he's come up with people, process, and technology, which we agree is the triad that should pull all these things together. And he asked people, what was the problem? And it turns out that 90 to 95% of the problems in data are not technology problems. They are people and process problems.
Yes.
So while it's a good idea to have some technology to help out, that's only part of the solution. And we need to incorporate process as well as people dimensions. And the question of how to get it, I'll give you a little bit of insight here that gets me a lot of business, quite frankly.
Okay.
We've been doing executive data literacy education for some time.
Right.
And it's not that the executives are going to be programming in R. But what they are doing is making decisions such as, should I put the data quality before I buy Salesforce or after I buy Salesforce?
Right.
And that recognition. Now, when we go in to sell them this, it's basically a 3 90-minute sessions spaced out over a couple of months. We like to have some reflection time in this so that they can grow and learn. And
sure.
We charge them twice as much if they won't assign the executives homework. And we tell them that.
Okay.
Say if you want to do this right, the course is X, but there's actually 10 hours of homework that we want from the executives between the first one and the second one. And if they say our executives won't do the homework, then we say that our price was X is now 2X. Because you do need to have that time to get reflection. And we've done this in the academic world quite a lot.
Sure.
There's simply no way that anybody will obtain anything from 7 or 5 8-hour days of Zoom training, in order to do this. It's just taxing. So you do need to space these things out so that the ideas can kind of sink in, that people can recognize them, and people can see, oh, you're right, Peter, I cut down on the number of sharings that I was doing on my mobile phone and my battery lasts longer. Okay, that's part of data strategy, believe it or not. It's not doing too many things at once and focusing in on a couple things and trying to make them.
And I, talking about leadership, then, and I want to come back to the whole people, process, tech, and more people, process. But let's just talk about, what you mentioned earlier. In the book, you talk about the enterprise data executive, and when I read that, I don't get a feeling that the enterprise data executive is typically what we call the chief data officer. It's not, you don't label it that way. You're talking about an individual who's responsible for this thing called data, and who will drive, the uptake of data strategy and so on. So, with the enterprise data, or the EDE, enterprise data executive, and the CDO, the chief data officer. And I know that you've written another book on the chief data officer. Where's the convergence, or are they the same thing? Or are there obviously some organizations that don't need a chief data officer, and it's just going to be somebody in the current business lines that are going to take over with data? So what was your thinking with the EDE as opposed to the chief data officer?
That's a great question. And the little shindig that we do at MIT every year around the data leadership topic that we do. We started as the leadership group of that organization. And saying, okay, so what do we need to do to say what is a chief data officer? And as you might imagine, it was heavily populated by private sector organizations at that time. So they said things like, well, you must have $350 million in annual sales, right? And other sort of benchmarks like this that don't apply to people in the public sector that actually are managing much more complexity than that. So we saw that there was a need for a term besides just chief data officer. Even though that's the moniker, I'm sure I could have sold twice as many books if I called it CDO and data strategy.
I was really surprised, but it was, I actually enjoyed that that narrative.
Well, my preferred title is the top data job.
Okay.
Right?
Or the top data dog. I mean,
There you go. Absolutely. And so, what we found is that there are lots of people in most organizations that are not leaders at the top, but that are the top data person. I know an insurance company that's not too far from here, where there's a VP who knows all the data, and their data catalog is that individual. People go to his office and say, hey, do you know where I could find or who I could talk to about? And this individual knows it. Now, as you were talking about risk earlier, that's a high risk to the organization.
Sure. Yeah.
That gentleman wins the lottery and boom, all of that data knowledge is going.
Or as we say, he gets run over by a bus, and that's that.
I was trying to be positive, You got it. So there are people who are not at the table, who are not at that top level, but who are nevertheless leading data exercises. And that's why we sort of pulled that other additional set of terms. I personally don't care what it is. I care whom it is.
Yes, absolutely.
The other thing that happens, though, too, is that as soon as you propose another C level, all the other C's gang up and say, do we really need? So Wikipedia's got a great list of 58 chief titles that are out there that you can look at.
And this is what I was going to, this is going to be the next sort of, spin-off from the enterprise data executive and the CDO. I was being interviewed yesterday, and somebody asked me that question. So do you think that we need, is the C-suite overpopulated now? Yes, it is. Do we need to have the CDO in that position reporting to the CEO? Do we need to overexploit? Because we've got now the chief analytics officer. I met a new one the other day, the chief information and data officer, and the chief digital officer and the chief data officer, the chief AI officer now. So are we just overdoing this thing? And is there a simpler way of just, calming it all down and saying, look, this thing called data has been around for a while. Yeah. And we need to understand it, and we need to nurture it, and we need to build on it, and we need to get the value from it, and we need to, help the business reach their targets and their revenues, etc. Where does it end in terms of, these new positions? Do we need them all, or is it just rolled into one person?
Let's talk about structure for just a minute. One of the things I like to do with the groups that I'm working with is help them to draw some parallel structures. So you won't find an organization on the planet that says, you know what, I think everybody's going to behave and we're never going to hire any new people. So let's get rid of HR as our cost saving measure. Right. And people would go, whoa, that's a very big risk to do something like that. And yet they're letting data have this. Now, let's go back to the numbers on this as well. If you go to LinkedIn right now, January of 2021, you will find that there are more chief digital officers as CDOs than you will find as chief data officers. So there's confusion in the marketplace. It's about 30% greater at this point in time. Just the measures at the beginning of the month. I'm sure that'll change. But there's if I hire a chief digital officer, is that good enough? Typically not, because of course data is the foundation of digital.
Correct.
Can't exist digitally without data.
So where do we go out and say to organizations, well, okay, the chief digital officer does, drop the chief, the AI chief AI officer, maybe drop the chief there, but then we've got the CIO and the CTO and the CDO, the chief data officer. How do we get, say, for example, the CIO, who's been the mainstay in most organizations for years now, as you mentioned earlier? How do we get the if there is an incoming chief data officer and they have to have one at that board level, and certainly at that C-suite level, how do we make sure that we don't blur the lines between the two, the CIO and the CDO?
Well, you're hitting on a very significant problem. When my book, The Case for the Chief Data Officer, was translated into Mandarin, the title came back as Chief Data Officer Combat.
Oh, really?
Really, Now, I
No
didn't have anything
way.
to do with the translation, but they kind of read between the lines there and got a very
Got you.
nice. So
Got you.
we don't want to have that. We
No.
very much want to make certain that there is a good cooperative relationship between CIOs and CDOs. And quite frankly, we've done a disservice to the CIOs because if you look at their portfolio and their skill set and the skill sets of the organizations that they've created, it's much more around a chief integration
Yes.
officer or a chief technology officer or
Yes.
something along those lines that they're doing instead of actually managing information. And that's not their fault. Again, we've not socialized them well. We've not provided good education. Gartner's been a little bit behind the scenes on this in terms of the advisory services and other things like that. So I go for simpler messages. For example, I'm working with a state right now, and they're trying to establish their data governance program. And I know you work in this area a lot. And they have an executive data council, and then they have a data stewards council, and they have a bunch of other things. And my advice was, we understand what those terms are, but nobody outside of these conversations is going to. So let's call this the data group and nothing else. Right? It's just the data group. And so somebody's got to take care of that aspect of the business. If you want it to fall under the CIO, which about a third of them fall under that right now, that's okay. A third of CDOs now fall under a combination of a RO, risk officer, or a chief financial officer. Another third of them report directly to the chief executive officer. What we don't have is any research going on to see if that's the right model, because corporations are different or organizations are different, or are different models producing different results, because the research community is out there searching for cool new algorithms to make everything go faster. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to reward some things in our area as well. There's just been a absolute dearth of work in that area.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the different ways that we need to think about this in terms of, the chief data officer at some point going into the CEO, and those going into the CRO or the CFO. Certainly, I'm now seeing even to the COO, which is an interesting variation from that. But if I was to come from the business tomorrow, here's the thing. If I was to say, okay, we're going to appoint a chief data officer, but we're going to appoint somebody who's come from the business. And there's a person who's not as probably will get there to some extent, like your the insurance individual that you mentioned, who absolutely lives and breathes data and has got an inventory and so on. What qualities does that individual need to have in order to get into that role and be able to take that on? What would you say? Because fundamentally there are now, I think, in the States more so than probably the UK and Europe, there are a lot of companies that are actually, and I think you said it or mentioned it earlier, that are questioning whether they need these data teams because they haven't seen the return over the years with the investment that they've put into it. So they're now going back to the business to say, do we really need these people? Have they given you that, have they delivered that value over time? So if we were, going to appoint a business person, what qualities would you expect that person to have?
Well, it's interesting that you would bring up that as a scenario, because the book that we use to teach IT to our business executives is a wonderful book out of the Harvard Press called The Adventures of an IT Leader.
Okay.
Now, this is a
riveting read.
Well, interesting. I would call them kids, but they're not kids. They're adults, and they really do enjoy the book. It's very well written. And what it is that this is a gentleman who is, on a particular Friday, just found out that the old CEO has been fired and a new one's been brought in, and he's a slash and burn kind of individual. And when it's his turn to go in and meet with the gentleman, he says, so I have one role for you. You've been head of sales for a while. And he's going, please tell me I'm the COO. Please tell me I'm the COO. He says, I'm going to make you the CIO.
Oh, dear.
Well, we've tried having technical people as CIOs for a long time, and that hasn't produced the results. And I think the same thing is here. So let's take the answer to your question on two parts. In some organizations, there's not much data debt, and you really can spin up BI initiatives, throw yourself some cloud computing in place, try a couple different models, test some things very quickly, see what works out, and then productionize the thing. On the other hand, for old line organizations, and that really is most of them, you've got some social engineering that needs to be done here.
Sure.
So your first CDO, and I have a picture that I use to illustrate this when I'm speaking with groups. It's of a worldwide wrestling match, and there's one big hairy wrestler who's getting ready to jump on top of the other hairy wrestler, right?
Yeah.
And it's captioned. It says the enterprise data executive takes one for the team.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that go out and get shot, but what
Yeah.
it is to say is that there's a certain role to be playing when you need to come in and change the organization fundamentally.
Mm-hmm.
If the organization has a very strong CIO who's done excellent work and produced good results, and that CDO is supposed to report to them, that could be a problem.
Yeah.
It's going to have to change hearts and minds. You're going to have to go out to the business and say, I know that IT has a 3-year and $30 million IT backlog that they can't get around to doing, but we can do some things with data that can still help. And by the way, spinning up stuff on cloud computing is not as expensive as it used to be, and consequently, we can do some things very, very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Given that type of a thing, maybe that a role for that organization is somebody who's a change management leader who comes in and knows how to not really upset the apple cart, but still make those changes occur and take the treads off the apple cart and put a wheel on it, or make it a boat, or whatever it is that you need to do. And then maybe at that point, it's a good time for that individual to go find another company to go in and do some things, or transform into a different role. And then a CDO can come on and start to work in the areas that they'd really like to work on. So it kind of depends on where the company is, but absolutely, if you can't articulate this, and there's another part of this too, you and I get it, whatever that means, right? There's a couple conversations that you can have to figure out whether people get it or not. And if you don't know to have those conversations, you won't know who are your allies in the organization, who can help you out, and what types of changes are going to make sense for this particular organization.
So, let's just change tack for a moment. I'd really like to understand more about what you're doing now. I mean, there's loads of things that, we can talk about. There's still stuff on my book that I've been, taking notes into. But, something interesting that you on your LinkedIn account, you've got three shapes on there. You've got 2 circles, and you've got a hexagon. Bad data plus awesome thing still equals bad results. So that's your logo, your strapline, your logo. So what's that all about? Tell me.
So there was a LinkedIn posting. We all like LinkedIn. It's fun to watch and things like that. And I saw this really interesting one that popped up one day. This fellow says, "Hey, I just discovered something. It doesn't matter how good blockchain is. If we don't put good data into the blockchain, it's not going to work." And my only comment back was, "I'm sorry it took you until the age of 45 or whatever it was to get to that realization, because we have all known that input, process, output is a very good way of describing things, and if you have bad fuel to the input, it can't work."
Exactly.
So I actually sat down with my graphics person and said, "Could you doodle up something like for me real quick?" And she boom, slapped it on, and it took 10 minutes. And I think it's been quite powerful.
Okay.
Because people do realize that I can buy tech, I can AI as much as I want.
Sure.
I can get into machine learning. I mean, the book I'm working on right now is a book on data literacy.
Okay.
And one of the things that we'll see in literacy is that most data literacy initiatives now are focusing on how data people talk to each other, and whether a PhD in data science should have 16 years of statistics or 24 years of statistics, right? And those are good conversations. I'm not saying don't have those conversations, but if we want to make a dent in the world, and more importantly, if an organization wants to change their workforce, making our knowledge workers more data literate is the easiest thing we can do to improve overall productivity throughout the entire organization.
Yeah.
Because data is so pervasive.
You're right. But, and I sometimes, and maybe you picked up on it just a second ago when you said data literacy is seen as how data people speak to each other. But then, when I look at the definitions of data literacy, the ability to understand, argue, and debate around data, I can't remember the extent. MIT's got their own, Gartner's got their own, the Data Literacy Project's got their own. How do you define data literacy? Because you used it earlier on, actually, in a different context when you talked about the program that you delivered to executives, because to me that sounds more like understanding the data value chain as opposed to data literacy. So they can start a program of works around this far easier than going in cold. So, from that to now writing a book on data literacy, how do you define it? What's your overarching view on that because it's become quite a buzzword in the industry as well.
It really has. And I think all of the definitions that we're moving towards are good.
Mm-hmm.
What I've done is defined 5 levels of data literacy that just happen to correspond to the 5 levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
I see. Okay.
Everybody understands Maslow.
Yeah.
And we're going to put the data professionals at that very top self-actualization piece.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also arguing in the book that if you have somebody who's not an adult and they have a mobile device, there are some concepts of data literacy that they should have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't harbor any illusion that we're going to pass a law that says you can't hand a kid a mobile phone and let them run about the world without passing some sort of a data literacy course. But if we could start the process of households having conversations around data and things like that, and people saying to them, oh, I out walking in the woods the other day with a friend of mine who I ran into, and he said, I'm really in a bad mood today. And I said, oh, why? He said, well, my daughter ran through our data cap and now I can't do any Zoom meetings. Right? Well, if the daughter understood that running through it on a streaming thing or going over and picking up the same DVD that you already have, or whatever, or even getting it out of your digital locker that you have on the house, right? This guy's pretty literate. That would have been better than restreaming it a third or fourth or fifth time on that. So getting these concepts into our population early on. Now, I mentioned that's the what I call the mobile data spreaders. Then I call the next level up adult data spreaders.
Okay.
Because, of course, as adults, we can expect them to do certain things. Then we go into knowledge workers. And the difference between adult data spreaders and knowledge workers is that most knowledge workers can be put under a code of conduct. So that now organizations, I believe, should be screening for data literacy concepts as they come onto the organizational workforce. And if the workforce hasn't had this screening before, then we need to go back and educate the workforces that are there.
Sure.
So data literacy really breaks out into these 5 categories. I haven't gone through all 5 of them yet, but they are much more aimed at things that occur outside of the technology realm that you and I inhabit in there, because our knowledge workers, that's the definition of a knowledge worker. It's somebody who works with data.
Correct.
That's where we need data literacy and getting them. And so there's what I call 30 citizen data literacy needs. One of the things we're not good in our industry is coming up with good acronyms. ROT I love. By the way, I did not invent ROT. Somebody else did, but I wish I could find it and give them credit for it. It was actually on the internet one day that I saw it. But we need to go in and put these things in place so that every organization has a much broader approach to how they do data. And these 30 citizen data literacy needs are objective behaviors that you can test for. And if we get to those pieces, that will really be my sort of definition of data literacy. I haven't thought of a good way to sew it all together, and it's got to be simple. But I know you and I have spoken about the governance. For example, there's lots of definitions of data governance out there as well. I like managing data with guidance. Yeah.
It's simple, effective.
4 words. Well, it's an elevator speech that you can have with an executive who says, I hear you're starting data governance. Can you tell me what that means? Right. And if you sit down and say, well, it's about decision rights and blah, 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 blah.
Oh, God, no. You've lost them.
You've lost.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's get back to something that we talked about earlier. People, process, and tech. And, we all have lived in this world. Most people will reference it at some point in their working life. 95% of that is the people and process. And from my perspective, a lot of it is to do with culture. And one of the things that I fundamentally see as the biggest flaw when I go in and do a data program. And it's not necessarily with everybody, but I would say probably 80% of businesses. When I talk to the executives and say, listen, in order for me to understand, one, I need to see a business strategy, and I need to understand where you're going and what your drivers are and what levers you're pulling and so on. And then what I want to do is understand how your business works. What are the processes, fundamental things that make things happen, and some of the nuances, because there's going to be and I often get this quizzical look. So, well, they look at me, then they look at their second in command looks at somebody else, and they go down the chain, and suddenly they say, where processes, we've got some, but not that many. That sort of one, the red alert goes off in my head.
You bet.
And then the other side is, well, we just want to get the tech piece in and don't worry about the people. Or I often find that we've built this stuff, but without really understanding the decisions or the actions that need to be taken. So culture is an established thing in a business. It's been there for years, hundreds of years. Nobody really has questioned it, but now we're beginning to see the challenge of embedding data programs. And the biggest challenge for me is that cultural piece, because as you said, 5% of it is in tech. There's so much tech available. We're awash with tech. How do we start to sort of not come back to the starting block, but how do you start to embed those cultural pieces from the get-go on a data program? And what would you suggest to anybody out there who's beginning their data program on that journey to think about before they get into it fully blown?
2 points. One, I'll tell a quick story that emphasizes your point as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that most of the financial organizations have figured out that they need to do some kind of metadata management.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows up on various assessments that they do. This is outside of our industry entirely. This is somebody who's going across the financial industry.
Okay.
But they will ask a question, do you have a metadata repository?
Mm-hmm.
And I got a call from one of the metadata repository vendors who said, Peter, would you help us out with this particular organization? They're on the East Coast of the US here. And they bought our product 10 years ago.
Okay.
But as far as we know, they haven't installed it.
Wow. Okay.
And so we had a couple conversations with them. They said, yeah, we realize that, we'd like to install it, but management won't give us that because the only thing management has to answer for is, do we have? And
I see.
The answer was,
okay,
we have
yes.
it right here. Exactly. And so the vendor was disappointed that they couldn't get more out of this, but management thought that by buying this box, even though they knew full well that it was not in,
sure,
but they could answer that question yes and come away with it. So the question of what do we need to do from a culture perspective, one of the nice things about getting old is that I don't want to say don't care, but you can be a little bit more choosy.
Yeah.
So in the literacy book, what I'm doing is arguing specifically that trying to adopt data has to be somewhat akin to starting a 12-step program.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I like that.
And everybody goes, right, everybody, because the executives know this. They've had executives that, they want to keep on the team, but may have had a drinking problem, and they're going through it, and they go to their meetings on a regular basis. And they understand that. It's a big commitment.
Yeah.
And so if they're not willing to talk to me about that, and I use this to talk about, did you know Larry English when he was alive? He was one of the fathers of data quality.
Yes, the name does ring a bell. Yeah, yes, somebody was talking about his book the other day. Yes, yeah, it's like the book. Yeah.
And I have to say, I was inspired by his approach because I've run into Larry in the airports, and one of Larry's things was he would not work with any company that the CEO would not meet with him.
Oh wow, okay.
And if they wouldn't meet with him, he wouldn't do work for them. And
I'm going to take the same position as him.
Yeah. I mean, why not, right?
Yeah.
If you have multiple choices, let's find customers that are trying to be helped as opposed to some customers that don't want to be helped. And that goes back to culture. So one of the things is don't go in and think that you can ignore the cultural aspects.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the way we do it around here kind of thing. And,
Yeah.
they've seen consultants come and consultants go over the years. When I was working for the US federal government, I would have the same thing. Hi, I'm here from Washington and I'm here to help, right? And yep, we've seen your kind come and seen your kind go, and we'll be here long after you've gone, and whatever initiative you're doing probably won't work. Yeah, it's a 12-step program. And it says, we are really going to make a commitment to this. And that includes a public declaration, which means that somebody can come along in a year and say, hey, what happened to that data stuff we were doing? If they haven't got a track record on that, it's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm. So there's an element of bringing in, obviously, the CEO. There's an element of committing to something, and there's an element of healing. Because that's what a 12-step program does. It helps that person to reflect, to heal, to understand the issues that they've had, and to start to address those. So it sounds like the right approach, and certainly I would like to have the conversation with any CEO on the about a data 12-step program. So I look forward to reading about that. Yeah, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I know that there are so many different questions that I've got in my in my head, and and we could talk for forever. I think with the wealth of experience that you have. What's the future hold for companies that are looking at just implementing a team of data scientists who will spin up algorithms? What would you say to those companies to do, to stop, to think about, to consider what they need to do and how they need to do it?
Well, of course, one of the challenges is most people don't know how data scientists are actually taught. And this is nothing against the technical skills that they're learning, but it leaves out several important dimensions. There's three of them in particular. The first one is productivity. These data scientists will go and, oh gosh, the dates form is not the right set, so they'll go and download Trifecta and try and move it around or something along those lines. But every data scientist will tell you that they spend 80% of their time munging the data. Yeah. And 20% of the time analyzing it. We incentivize them to go through and create new useful breakthroughs in this. So while a data scientist might come up with something that's very cool, they might not have any idea whether that cool thing will actually fit with the A, culture, and B, technology platform, 3, capabilities that the organization has. Sure. So they've got to be more grounded in the business environment and the business needs. And again, goes back to our talk about the key performance indicators. Yeah. What are the things in strategy that you're trying to do, and how can this data science investigation help to move those pieces forward? Yep. On that. But it doesn't happen most of the time. And so consequently, the data science group goes over. Everybody knows it takes 3 years to get a data science group up and running, which they have their feeds from their data. And of course, the other part of this is when they find problems with the data, they correct it within their group, but they never go back to production and fix that, which probably would have a really good help on the organization in the whole. Yeah. So I don't want to be too pessimistic about it. But we have seen data science, it's been in action. And quite frankly, there are more jobs out there now for data engineers on LinkedIn than there are for data scientists. So I think the pendulum's swinging back the other direction. We need both. There's no question.
Yeah, we do. So one last question from me, because as you started talking, that just raised something in my mind. As we build these data teams, as companies build these data teams, is there a specific makeup of what is required in a data team? And then how do we centralize that, or do we federate it? Is there a center of excellence still? How is it best that you've seen where data teams are more effective?
The centralized approach for starting seems to be more effective because what they see is across the various units that you are buying data that represents customer data from this organization. And guess what? Somebody over here is buying the same data set a second time. So the quick wins are going to come from that centralized group, or they all realize that, if you guys would actually learn R, we would be able to do some of this stuff faster. Because Excel, did you hear there was a COVID oopsie in the United States here? And
in the United States, no, we had our own COVID
You
oopsie
did.
here as well. Yeah. Yeah, somebody didn't realize about columns and rows and how many columns there can be in Excel. So
and that Excel just drops them
yes,
if you don't have the right file format. Now, why
yeah.
should a clerk have to know that?
No.
And yet, how many organizations do you think read those articles and went through and said, all right, here's a mandate. Make sure that all the Excel files that you're using, right? We have a lot of work ahead of us.
Excel's a whole new game. Let's yeah, I think we've got a long way to go in that aspect, and maybe that's going to be part of your data literacy book, perhaps. But I look forward to reading the new book when it comes out. But also there is a book that I do need to read about the CDO, which I look forward to getting. But it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Peter. I've really enjoyed our chat. As I said before, I think there's so many unanswered topics that we could have talked about. But thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I'm sure we will speak again.
Great. I'm looking forward to continuing to enjoy the podcast.
Thank you very much, Peter.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Thank you.